The heart monitor flatlined. For exactly 7 seconds, there was nothing but that long, merciless tone cutting through the sterile air of the private hospital suite. The sound of a 28-year-old man dying. But what happened next would change everything. Not the doctors who had given up, not the specialists flown in from 3 continents, not the millions of dollars spent on experimental treatments. No. What saved Marcus Wellington III, heir to a $600 million empire, was something his family would have never believed possible. It was the hands of a woman they refused to look in the eye. A woman they called the Help. A woman whose name they couldn't be bothered to learn, and in 7 seconds, she did what 3 years of the world's best medicine couldn't do. But before I tell you how she did it, you need to understand something. You need to understand who Grace Okonkwo really was. And more importantly, you need to understand the cruelty she endured to get to that moment. Because this isn't just a story about a miracle. This is a story about what happens when you underestimate someone based on the color of their skin. This is a story about karma. And this is a story about justice. The Wellington estate sat like a crown jewel on 12 acres of manicured perfection in Greenwich, Connecticut. 18,000 square feet of imported Italian marble, hand-carved mahogany, and enough crystal chandeliers to light a small city. Victoria Wellington stood at the window of her morning room, watching the new hire walk up the service entrance path. Her lip curled almost imperceptibly, a gesture so practiced it had become second nature. "Margaret," she called to her house manager without turning around. "Is that the new one?" Margaret Chen, a stern woman who had served the Wellingtons for 15 years, appeared at her side. "Yes, ma'am, Grace Okonkwo. She comes highly recommended from the Hartford agency. 10 years of experience, specializing in, I don't need her life story." Victoria cut her off with a wave of her diamond-encrusted hand. "I need someone who can actually keep this house running while we deal with," she paused, her voice catching almost imperceptibly. "Marcus's situation." Margaret nodded. She'd learned long ago that any mention of the young Mr. Wellington was a wound that hadn't healed. 3 years since the accident. 3 years of watching this family slowly tear itself apart while their only son lay motionless in a hospital bed on the 3rd floor of the East Wing. "Should I bring her to meet you, ma'am?" Victoria finally turned from the window. At 62, she was still a striking woman, the kind of beauty that old money could preserve indefinitely. But there was something cold in her eyes now, something that hadn't been there before the accident. "No, I don't have time. Just make sure she understands the rules. She's not to enter the East Wing. She's not to speak unless spoken to, and she's certainly not to be seen by any guests." Victoria picked up her Hermes bag from the settee. "I have the charity luncheon. Richard is in the city until Thursday. Handle it." And with that, Victoria Wellington swept out of the room, leaving behind a cloud of Chanel numberfection. 5, and an order that would soon be broken in the most extraordinary way. Grace Okonkwo stood in the service entrance hallway, her modest suitcase at her feet, and took a deep breath. At 47 years old, Grace had seen the inside of more mansions than she could count. She'd cleaned crystal that cost more than her annual salary. She pressed linens that were worth more than the car she drove. She'd served families whose net worth exceeded the GDP of the country she was born in, but none of that had ever made her feel small. Because Grace Okonkwo knew something that people like Victoria Wellington would never understand. Your worth isn't determined by the size of your house or the weight of your diamonds. It's determined by the weight of your heart. She'd learned that lesson long ago in a small village in Nigeria from a grandmother who had nothing but gave everything. And later, she'd learned it again in the halls of Johns Hopkins University, where she'd studied nursing for 2 years before life had taken an unexpected turn. But that was a story for another time. Margaret Chen appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand, expression unreadable. "You the new housekeeper?" Grace nodded, extending her hand. "Grace Okonkwo. It's a pleasure to meet you." Margaret looked at the hand for a moment, then back at Grace's face. Something flickered in her eyes. Was it surprise? Recognition of a kindred spirit? Whatever it was, it passed quickly. She didn't take the hand. "Follow me. I'll show you your quarters and explain your duties." Margaret turned and began walking. "Keep up. I don't have all day." Grace lowered her hand slowly, letting the rejection roll off her like water off stone. She'd experienced worse, much worse. And she'd learned that people who acted cold were often just people who were afraid of warmth. She picked up her suitcase and followed. The servants' quarters were in the basement of the West Wing, a stark contrast to the opulence above. Small rooms, functional furniture, shared bathroom. Grace had seen better. She'd also seen worse. What caught her attention wasn't her own sparse accommodations. It was what Margaret said as they walked past a locked door at the end of the hallway. That door leads to the East Wing service corridor. You are never to go through it. Do you understand? Grace looked at the door. May I ask why? Margaret's jaw tightened. The East Wing is private. The family's son is being cared for there. He's been in a medical coma for 3 years. The family prefers to keep that area completely isolated. Only approved medical staff are allowed. A coma. 3 years. Something stirred in Grace's chest. That old instinct. The one she'd tried to bury when she'd had to leave nursing school to care for her dying mother. The one that had never quite gone away. That must be very difficult for the family, Grace said softly. Margaret's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. For just a moment, she looked less like a house manager and more like a human being carrying a heavy burden. It's not our place to discuss the family's private matters, but her voice had lost some of its edge. Come, I'll show you the cleaning schedule. Grace quickly learned the unwritten rules of the Wellington estate. Rule 1, be invisible. The family didn't want to see staff. They wanted clean rooms, pressed clothes, and gourmet meals that appeared as if by magic. The humans who made those things happen were an inconvenience to be avoided. Rule 2, don't ask questions about the son, about the accident, about the tension that seemed to permeate every interaction between Mr. and Mrs. Wellington. Just clean, just serve, just disappear. Rule 3, know your place. This rule was communicated not through words, but through 1,000 tiny interactions. The way Mrs. Wellington looked through her rather than at her. The way Mr. Wellington's assistant referred to her as the Black One when she thought Grace couldn't hear. The way certain members of the household staff seemed to resent her presence, as if her melanin was somehow contagious. Grace absorbed it all. And every night, in her small room in the basement, she prayed. Not for herself. Never for herself. She prayed for the young man in the East Wing whom she'd never met. The one trapped somewhere between life and death. The one whose parents seemed to be doing everything except actually being with him. Because in her first week, Grace noticed something troubling. The doctors came and went. The nurses rotated in 12-hour shifts. The specialists visited monthly. But Mr. and Mrs. Wellington? She'd seen them go to the East Wing exactly twice. And both times, they'd stayed less than 15 minutes. It didn't make sense. If that were her child, they'd have to drag her away. But it wasn't her place to judge. It wasn't her place to interfere. At least, that's what she told herself. It happened on a Tuesday. Grace was polishing the silver in the butler's pantry when she heard the commotion, raised voices, something crashing, then footsteps, rapid and panicked, heading toward the East Wing. She set down the polishing cloth and moved toward the door, her heart beginning to race. In the main hallway, she saw Margaret actually running toward the East Wing staircase. Behind her, 2 nurses in scrubs. Behind them, Mrs. Wellington, her face pale as death. What's happening? Someone asked. It's Marcus, one of the nurses called back. His vitals are crashing. Grace felt her feet moving before her brain gave permission. That old instinct. The one she'd tried to bury. It was screaming now. She followed the group up the stairs, through the door she'd been forbidden to enter, down a corridor lined with expensive art that no one ever looked at, and into a room that took her breath away. Not because of its luxury, though it was undeniably luxurious. A private hospital suite that rivaled any facility in the country. State-of-the-art equipment, original paintings on the walls, a view of the estate's gardens through floor-to-ceiling windows. No, what took her breath away was the young man in the bed. Even after 3 years of lying motionless, there was something striking about Marcus Wellington III. High cheekbones, strong jaw, skin that had gone pale but still held hints of the vitality he must have once possessed. He was beautiful in the way the tragedy is beautiful, heartbreaking and haunting all at once. But he was also dying. The monitors were screaming, numbers flashing red. The medical team was swarming around him, shouting orders, grabbing equipment. And standing in the corner, frozen, was Victoria Wellington. For the first time since Grace had arrived at the estate, she looked human, terrified, helpless, like a mother watching her child slip away. Grace knew she shouldn't be there. She knew she was breaking every rule. She knew that if anyone noticed her, she'd be fired on the spot. But she also knew something else. She knew that sound, that particular alarm, that specific combination of readings on the monitors. She'd seen it before, 15 years ago, in her second year of nursing school. A patient named Jerome Henderson, 42 years old, father of three. He'd been in a similar state, reduced consciousness, deteriorating vitals, doctors baffled. And Grace had been the one to notice what everyone else had missed. A medication interaction. Two drugs that were safe on their own but deadly in combination. The kind of thing that slipped through the cracks when a patient was on 17 different medications and being treated by multiple specialists who didn't always communicate. She'd caught it. Jerome Henderson had lived, and Grace had learned that sometimes the person with the least authority in the room sees what the experts miss. Now, standing in this doorway, watching this young man die while his mother watched helplessly, Grace felt that same instinct stirring. Something was wrong. Not just the obvious thing, not just that he was crashing. Something else, something systematic. She scanned the room, the IV bags, the medication charts on the wall, the equipment, the monitors. And then she saw it. A small detail, almost invisible, the kind of thing you'd only notice if you were looking for it. One of the IV lines wasn't right. The tube was kinked, not completely blocked, but restricted, and the bag it connected to, Grace squinted. The medication label was partially obscured, but she could make out enough. Her blood ran cold. She knew that drug. She knew what it did. And she knew that at a restricted flow rate, it would build up in the system in a way that could cause exactly what was happening right now. "Stop," she said. No one heard her. The chaos was too loud. "Stop," she shouted this time, louder than she'd ever shouted in her life. Everyone froze. Every head turned toward her. The black maid in the doorway. The one who wasn't supposed to be there. The one who had no business speaking, let alone shouting. Victoria Wellington's shock transformed into fury. "What are you doing here? Get out immediately." But Grace didn't move. She couldn't. Not when a life hung in the balance. "The IV line," she said, pointing. "The one on the left. It's kinked. The flow rate is wrong. That medication is building up in his system. That's what's causing the cardiac distress." For a moment, no one moved. The audacity of it, a cleaning woman telling doctors how to do their jobs, was simply too much to process. Then, Dr. Turchi. Morrison, the lead physician, looked at the line. His face went white. "She's right," he breathed. "Dear God, she's right." What happened next was a blur of controlled chaos. Orders shouted. The line unkicked and replaced. Counteractive medications administered. The screaming monitors slowly, gradually, returning to stable rhythms. And through it all, Grace stood in that doorway, her heart pounding, knowing that her life at the Wellington estate was probably over. But also knowing that Marcus Wellington III was still alive. That was worth any price. 30 minutes later, Grace stood in Victoria Wellington's private study. She'd been summoned. That was never good. Victoria sat behind her antique desk, her face an unreadable mask. Margaret stood to her left, looking deeply uncomfortable. Dr. E. Morrison sat in one of the leather chairs, his earlier gratitude having faded into something more complicated. "I've spoken with the medical team," Victoria began, her voice ice cold. "They've confirmed that what you identified was indeed the source of my son's crisis. If you hadn't noticed it," she paused, her jaw tightening, "they say he might have died." Grace waited. She knew this wasn't leading where one might expect. "However," Victoria continued, "that doesn't change the fact that you violated explicit instructions. You were told never to enter the East Wing. You were told never to interfere with private family matters. You were told to know your place." There it was, that phrase again, "know your place." "With respect, ma'am," Grace said quietly, "my place is wherever someone needs help." Victoria's eyes flashed. "Your place is wherever I say it is. I employ you. I could end your career with a single phone call." "Yes, ma'am, you could." The two women stared at each other. In the corner of the room, Margaret held her breath. Dr. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. Something changed in Victoria's expression. The ice cracked, just slightly, and for a moment, just a moment, Grace saw the grieving mother beneath the cold exterior. The woman who had spent 3 years building walls to protect herself from hope. Dr. 1. "Morrison," Victoria said, not breaking eye contact with Grace, "in your medical opinion, does this woman have any relevant expertise?" The doctor cleared his throat. I asked her some questions after the incident. It seems she has some nursing training. Incomplete, but substantial. And she has an eye for detail that I frankly find remarkable. Victoria absorbed this. The wheels were clearly turning behind those cold blue eyes. You have nursing training, she said to Grace. Why are you working as a maid? It was a fair question, one Grace had answered many times before. Life doesn't always go according to plan, ma'am. I had to leave school to care for my mother. By the time she passed, I was too old and too poor to go back. Cleaning houses paid the bills. It's honest work. Honest work, Victoria repeated, as if tasting something unfamiliar. And yet today, you broke every rule I gave you. Yes, ma'am, I did. Why? Grace took a breath. Because your son was dying, and rules aren't more important than lives. The silence stretched. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed. Outside, a gardener's truck rumbled past. Finally, Victoria spoke. You're not fired. Grace blinked. But you're also not going back to your regular duties. Not yet. Victoria stood, moving to the window, her back to the room. My son has been in that bed for 3 years. Every specialist, every treatment, every experimental procedure, nothing has worked. The doctors tell me he may never wake up, that I should consider options. Her voice cracked on that last word. But today, you saw something they missed, something that could have killed him. A stranger, a cleaning woman, saw what all their degrees and expertise couldn't see. She turned back to face Grace. I want you to spend time with him, in the East Wing. Observe. Do what you did today. Be my eyes when I can't be there myself. Margaret stepped forward, her face alarmed. Mrs. Wellington, with all due respect, that's highly irregular. The liability alone. I don't care about liability. Victoria's voice was steel again. I care about my son. And this woman. She looked at Grace with an expression that was still cold but no longer dismissive. May be the first person in 3 years to see him as something other than a medical problem to be solved. Grace felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. This was unexpected. This was dangerous. This was an opportunity that made no logical sense. And yet, I'll do it, she said, but I have conditions. Victoria raised an eyebrow. Margaret looked like she might faint. The maid making demands of the millionaire. Unheard of. Go on. I want access to his complete medical records. I want to be able to ask questions of the medical staff without being ignored or dismissed. And I want to be able to sit with him, not just observe, sit, talk to him, even if he can't hear me. Why would you want to talk to someone in a coma? Grace smiled, the first real smile she'd allowed herself since arriving at this cold, beautiful prison. Because, Mrs. Pramps, Wellington, maybe no one's really tried. Sometimes people just need someone to reach them in a different way. Victoria stared at her for a long moment. Then, impossibly, the corner of her mouth twitched. You have unusual ideas for a maid. I have unusual ideas for anyone, ma'am. It's a gift. And so it was decided. Grace Okonkwo, the invisible woman, the one they called the Help, would become the official companion to the comatose heir of a $600 million empire. But what no one knew, not Victoria, not Margaret, not any of the doctors or staff, was that Grace was about to uncover a secret so dark, so dangerous, that it would shake the very foundations of the Wellington family, and nothing would ever be the same again. Grace's first night in the East Wing was quiet, too quiet. She sat in a chair beside Marcus's bed, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest, listening to the steady beep of the monitors. The night nurse had done her rounds and retreated to the small station down the hall, leaving Grace alone with a young man she'd never officially met. Hello, Marcus, she said softly. My name is Grace. I'm going to be spending some time with you, if that's all right. No response. Of course. The doctors say you probably can't hear me. But I've never put much stock in what doctors say. They said my mother had 3 months to live, and she held on for 4 years. They said my sister would never walk again, and she ran a marathon. Doctors know a lot, but they don't know everything. She reached out and took his hand. It was cool, but not cold. Alive, but not living. You've been sleeping for a long time, haven't you? 3 years is a very long nap, even for someone who's been through what you've been through. She'd read his file by then. Dr. Morrison had given her access, somewhat reluctantly. The accident had been a car crash. Marcus had been driving back from the city late at night. Another driver ran a red light. The collision was catastrophic. Marcus survived, but with severe head trauma. He'd been in a coma ever since. But there were things in the file that troubled Grace. small inconsistencies, notes that didn't quite add up, questions no one seemed to be asking. Why had Marcus been driving alone that night when he had a personal driver? Why had he been coming from the city when his calendar showed he'd had no appointments there? Why had trace amounts of a sedative been found in his blood, a sedative he wasn't prescribed? The official story was that the sedative came from contaminated food or drink earlier that day. An unfortunate coincidence that may have slowed his reflexes contributed to the accident. But Grace had learned long ago to question coincidences, especially convenient ones. "I don't know what happened to you," she whispered to Marcus. "Not really, but I'm going to find out, and then I'm going to help you wake up, I promise." The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. The machines hummed their mechanical lullabies. And somewhere, deep in the darkness of Marcus Wellington's consciousness, something stirred. What Grace doesn't know is that her promise has set something in motion, something that powerful people have been trying to keep buried for 3 years. In part 2, she will discover the truth about the night of the accident. She will make an enemy of someone she trusted, and she will face a choice that will test everything she believes in. But most importantly, she will begin to reach Marcus in a way no one else has. Because Grace Okonkwo didn't just bring nursing skills to the Wellington estate, she brought something far more powerful. She brought hope. His finger moved. Grace sat straight up, her heart slamming against her ribs. It was 3:47 a.m. on a Thursday night, 6 weeks into her new role, and she had been reading aloud from Marcus's favorite book, a worn copy of The Count of Monte Cristo she'd found on his shelf. She'd been at the part where Edmond Dantes finally escapes his prison, and he threw himself into the sea. That's when it happened, a twitch, small, almost invisible, but unmistakable. Marcus Wellington's right index finger had moved. "Marcus?" Grace leaned forward, her voice trembling. "Marcus, can you hear me?" Nothing. The monitors showed no change. The steady rhythm of machines continued their mechanical chorus. But Grace had seen it. She knew what she'd seen. After 3 years of absolute stillness, something was changing. And what Grace didn't know, couldn't possibly know, was that this tiny movement would set off a chain of events that would expose one of the darkest secrets in the history of the Wellington family. Because someone in this house didn't want Marcus to wake up, and they would do anything to keep him silent. The days after Grace's confrontation with Victoria Wellington had been strange. The household staff treated her differently now. Not with more respect, exactly, but with a kind of wary curiosity. The black cleaning woman who had been elevated above her station. Who did she think she was? Grace ignored the whispers. She had work to do. Her first official session with Marcus began on a sunny Monday morning. The East Wing suite was bathed in golden light, the monitors casting their green glow, and Grace stood at the doorway with a small bag of items she'd brought from her own room. Dr. Turtell. Morrison was there, along with the morning nurse Rebecca. Both watched Grace with barely concealed skepticism. "Mrs. Wellington has given you permission to be here, Dr. II," Morrison said, "but I want to be clear about the medical realities. Marcus suffered severe traumatic brain injury. The damage to his frontal and temporal lobes was extensive. There's no clinical evidence that he can hear, feel, or perceive anything in his environment." "I understand, doctor. Do you?" "Because what you're proposing to do, talking to him, playing music, stimulating his senses, it's been tried before, by professional therapists, with no results." Grace met his eyes. "With respect, sir, how many hours did those therapists spend with him?" Morrison frowned. "I don't have the exact numbers, but the records show an average of 45 minutes per session, 3 times per week. Highly structured, clinically focused." Grace set her bag down beside the bed. "I'm proposing something different. Presence, consistency, human connection. Not as a treatment, but as a relationship. A relationship with an unconscious man? A relationship with a person, doctor. Whatever state his consciousness is in, he's still a person." Morrison exchanged a glance with Rebecca. The look said everything. This woman is delusional, but he'd been given his orders. Victoria Wellington wanted this experiment to proceed, and no one in this house said no to Victoria Wellington. "Fine, we'll monitor his vitals. If there's any sign of distress, you'll be removed immediately. Understood? Understood?" They left. And for the first time, Grace was truly alone with Marcus. She pulled a chair close to his bed and sat down. For a long moment, she simply looked at him, really looked. 3 years of stillness had taken their toll. His muscles had atrophied despite the physical therapy. His skin was pale, almost translucent. His hair dark brown, according to old photos, had grown long and was usually tied back by the nurses. But there was something still there, something in the architecture of his face that spoke of who he'd been, who he still was, somewhere deep inside. "Hello again, Marcus," Grace said softly. "It's Grace. Remember? We met a few days ago, though you were a bit preoccupied at the time with almost dying." She smiled at her own dark humor. "Sorry about that. I have a strange sense of humor. My mother used to say I laughed at funerals because I didn't know what else to do." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small object, a worn wooden elephant, no bigger than her thumb. "This was my grandmother's. She gave it to me when I was 7 years old, just before I left Nigeria to come to America. She said it would remind me to be strong. Elephants never forget," she told me. "And neither should you. Never forget who you are. Never forget where you come from." Grace placed the elephant on Marcus's bedside table, where he would see it if he ever opened his eyes. "I'm going to tell you about myself, Marcus. Not because I think you care, but because that's what friends do. They share pieces of themselves. And right now, I'm the closest thing to a friend you have, so you're stuck with me." And so it began. Every day, Grace spent at least 6 hours in Marcus's room. She talked, she read, she played music, everything from classical to jazz to Nigerian highlife, trying to find something that might spark a response. She opened the windows when the weather was nice, letting in fresh air and birdsong. She described what she saw outside, the changing colors of the leaves, the gardeners at work, the occasional deer that wandered onto the property. She told him about her life, about growing up in Lagos in a family of 7 children, about her father, a school teacher who died when she was 12, about her mother, who cleaned houses, just like Grace would one day to keep food on the table, about coming to America at 19 with nothing but a suitcase and a dream. She told him about nursing school, about the joy she'd felt caring for patients, learning to read the stories their bodies told, about Jerome Henderson, the man whose life she'd saved by noticing a medication interaction, about the pride she'd felt that day, the validation that she was where she was supposed to be. And she told him about leaving, about her mother's diagnosis, about the impossible choice between her education and her duty, about flying back to Nigeria, spending 4 years watching the strongest woman she'd ever known slowly fade away, about returning to America afterward, too old and too broke to go back to school, with nothing to show for her nursing dreams but a head full of knowledge she'd never officially be allowed to use. "But you know what, Marcus? I don't regret it, not for a second. Those 4 years with my mother, they were the hardest of my life, but also the most important, because I learned something. I learned that being present for someone, truly present, with your whole heart, that's the greatest gift you can give." She squeezed his hand. "That's what I'm offering you, my presence, my attention, my stubborn belief that there's still someone in there waiting to come back." The monitors beeped, the machines hummed, and somewhere in the darkness, Marcus listened. But Grace wasn't just there to be a companion. She was also there to find answers. The questions that had bothered her from the beginning, about the night of the accident, about the sedative in Marcus's blood, about the inconsistencies in the official story, those questions wouldn't leave her alone. She started small, casual conversations with the nursing staff. What was he like before, she'd ask. What kind of person was he? The answers painted a picture that didn't match the tragedy. Marcus Wellington III had been brilliant. Harvard undergrad, Stanford MBA, but with none of the arrogance those credentials might suggest. He'd worked his way through every department of Wellington Industries, his family's conglomerate starting at the bottom, earning respect rather than demanding it. He was kind, Rebecca the nurse told her one day. Not like, she stopped herself, not like his parents? Rebecca looked uncomfortable. I didn't say that, but she hadn't needed to. Grace learned that Marcus had been planning to take over the company. His father, Richard Wellington, was ready to step back. The transition had been announced. The board was on board. Everything was set. And then, 3 days before the official handover, Marcus's car had been T-boned by a drunk driver at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night. 3 days. The timing sat in Grace's stomach like a stone. She dug deeper. The police report was sealed standard for a family of the Wellington status. But Grace had her own resources. A cousin who worked in city records, a former colleague who had connections in the Hartford Medical Examiner's office. Piece by piece, she assembled a picture. The other driver, a man named Thomas Harwell, had been almost twice the legal limit. He'd run a red light at 60 miles per hour, striking Marcus's vehicle on the driver's side. Harwell had died on impact. Marcus had barely survived, open and shut according to the police. A tragic accident. But Grace found something else. Thomas Harwell had been broke. Bankrupt, in fact. He'd lost his house 6 months before the accident. His wife had left him. He had nothing. And yet, 2 weeks before the crash, his bank account had received a deposit of $50,000. Cash. No traceable source. Grace stared at the number on the screen of the county library computer, her hands trembling. Someone had paid Thomas Harwell. Someone had paid him, and then he'd killed himself driving into Marcus Wellington's car. This wasn't an accident. This was attempted murder. Grace knew she had to be careful. If someone in the Wellington family or close to them had tried to kill Marcus, then they wouldn't hesitate to silence a nosy maid who got too close to the truth. She started watching, paying attention to who came and went from the East Wing, who asked questions about Marcus's condition, who seemed nervous when Grace was around. And slowly, a pattern emerged, not from the family, not from the medical staff, from someone Grace had trusted, someone who had been in the house for 15 years, Margaret Chen. It started with small things. The way Margaret would appear whenever Grace asked too many questions, the way she'd steer conversations away from the accident, the way she'd watch Grace with an intensity that went beyond normal curiosity. Then came the incident with the files. Grace had been searching for Marcus's original admission records, the ones from the night of the accident, before he'd been transferred to the home care suite. She'd found a reference to them in Dr. 20. Morrison's notes, but couldn't locate the actual documents. She asked Margaret for help. "Those files are sealed," Margaret said, "Mrs. Dashan, Wellington's orders. But I have access to all of Marcus's medical records." Dr. Morrison said, "Dr. Morrison doesn't control everything in this house." Margaret's voice was sharp. "Those files are sealed. That's final." Grace let it go. But later that night, when the house was quiet, she crept back to the East Wing office. The files weren't just sealed. They were gone. And in their place was a sticky note in Margaret's handwriting. "Move to secure storage. Do not access." 6 weeks of this. 6 weeks of reading, talking, playing music. 6 weeks of investigation, suspicion, careful maneuvering. 6 weeks of making no visible progress. And then, at 3:47 a.m. on that Thursday night, Marcus's finger moved. Grace sat frozen, afraid to breathe, afraid to hope. She'd seen it. She knew she'd seen it. "Marcus, can you hear me?" Nothing. She reached for the call button to summon the nurse and stopped. What if this was a trap? What if someone was monitoring the cameras, waiting to see what she'd do? If Margaret was involved in whatever had happened to Marcus, if others were involved too, then announcing this development might be dangerous. Instead, Grace made a decision. She would document this herself, watch for more signs, build a case that couldn't be dismissed or covered up. She pulled out her phone and started recording. "The time is 3:52 a.m., she whispered. "This is Grace Okonkwo. I just witnessed what appeared to be voluntary movement in the patient's right index finger. I'm going to attempt to reproduce the stimulus." She picked up the book, found her place, read aloud again, and he threw himself into the sea. Nothing. She tried again, different passages, different voices, different emotions, nothing. For 2 hours, she tried everything she could think of, but Marcus remained still. Finally, exhausted, she set down the book and took his hand. "I know you're in there," she said. "I know you're fighting, and I want you to know something. I found out about the money, the $50,000 that was paid to the man who hit you. Someone tried to kill you, Marcus, and I think someone in this house knows who." The monitors beeped, the machines hummed, and then, impossible and unmistakable, Marcus's hand squeezed hers. Grace didn't sleep that night. How could she? Everything had changed. Marcus was in there. He was aware, at least partially. He'd heard her. He'd responded. And he knew about the attempt on his life. The next morning, Grace made a dangerous choice. She confronted Margaret Chen directly. She found the house manager in her small office off the main kitchen, reviewing delivery schedules with the efficiency of a military commander. "Mrs. Chen," Grace said, closing the door behind her. "We need to talk." Margaret looked up. Something flickered in her eyes. Alarm? Recognition? "I'm busy. This won't take long." Grace sat down uninvited. "I know about the files. The sealed records from the night of Marcus's accident. The ones that disappeared." Margaret's face was stone. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do. And I think you know more than that. I think you know about Thomas Harwell, about the $50,000, about why someone wanted Marcus dead 3 days before he was supposed to take over his father's company." The silence stretched. Grace could hear her own heartbeat. Finally, Margaret spoke. Her voice was different now, tired, heavy with something that might have been guilt. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." "Then explain it to me." Margaret stood, walked to the window, looked out at the perfect gardens, the immaculate grounds. "The Wellingtons are not good people," she said quietly. "Oh, they donate to charities, they smile for cameras, they play the part. But underneath," she turned back to Grace, "underneath, they are capable of things you can't imagine. Mrs. Wellington hired me. She wants Marcus to recover." "Does she?" Margaret's laugh was bitter. "Victoria Wellington is a complicated woman, but she's not the one you need to worry about." "Then who?" Margaret hesitated. For a moment, Grace thought she was going to say something important, something that would unlock everything. But then the door opened. Richard Wellington stood in the doorway, tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, and absolutely livid. "Margaret, my office, now." He didn't look at Grace, didn't acknowledge her existence, just turned and walked away, expecting to be followed. Margaret gathered herself. As she passed Grace, she paused just long enough to whisper, "Be careful, they're watching you." And then she was gone. That night, Grace received a text from an unknown number, "Gazebo. Midnight, come alone. I have information about Marcus." Every instinct told her this was a trap. The mysterious text, the isolated location, the horror movie setup. But Grace had never been one to run from danger, and whoever had tried to kill Marcus was still out there, still watching, still waiting. She went. The gazebo sat at the far edge of the property, near the tree line that separated the Wellington estate from protected forest land. At midnight, it was nothing but shadows and starlight. Grace waited, watched, listened. A figure emerged from the trees. It was Dr. Morrison. "Thank you for coming," he said. He looked different outside the clinical setting, older, more human, more afraid. He sent the text. "I had to be careful. The house is monitored. Every room, every hallway, even the east wing." Grace felt a chill. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that what happened to Marcus wasn't an accident, but you already knew that, didn't you?" She nodded slowly. Morrison sat down on the gazebo bench, his shoulders slumped. "I've been his doctor for 8 years. I knew him before the accident. He was brilliant, kind. He was going to change that company for the better. Redirect resources to sustainable energy. Increase worker wages. Phase out the overseas operations that were problematic. Problematic how? The Wellingtons have factories in 6 developing countries. The conditions in those factories would make you sick. Child labor. 16-hour shifts. Workers who die from exhaustion and are replaced the next day. Marcus wanted to end all of it. Grace felt her stomach turn, and someone wanted to stop him. Not someone. Richard Wellington. The world tilted. His own father. Morrison's voice was heavy with disgust. "I didn't know at first. I suspected, but I didn't know. Then, last year, I found something. A memo. Encrypted, but I managed to access it. A communication between Richard and someone else. I don't know who, discussing how to handle the Marcus problem." "Why haven't you gone to the police?" Morrison laughed bitterly. "The police?" "The Wellingtons own 3 judges and the district attorney. They have connections everywhere. If I came forward, I'd disappear. My family would disappear. The memo would vanish." He looked at Grace. "But you're different." "Different how?" "You're nobody, no offense. But that's your power. You're invisible to them. They don't see you as a threat, and you're already in position. You have access to Marcus. You have the training to understand what's happening to him, and you have something I lost a long time ago." "What's that?" "Courage." Grace absorbed this, the weight of it, the impossibility of it. A father who had tried to kill his own son to protect his profits. A house full of secrets. A young man lying in a bed, aware but trapped, waiting for someone to save him. "What do you want me to do?" Morrison reached into his pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. "This contains everything I've found. The memo, financial records, evidence of the payment to Thomas Harwell. It's not enough for a conviction, not yet, but it's a start." He pressed the drive into her hand. "Marcus is fighting. I've seen the scans. His brain activity has been increasing over the past few weeks, ever since you started spending time with him. Whatever you're doing, it's working. If he wakes up, when he wakes up, he'll be able to testify. He may have seen something that night. He may know something. And until then, you keep doing what you're doing. You keep talking to him. You keep reaching him, and you keep yourself alive. Morrison stood, looked at her one last time. Be careful, Grace. Richard Wellington is a monster wearing the mask of a man, and monsters don't hesitate to destroy anyone who threatens them. He disappeared into the trees, and Grace sat alone in the darkness holding a USB drive that could destroy an empire or get her killed. The next morning, Grace found a note under her pillow. Know what you're doing. Stop now or face the consequences. Her hands trembled as she read the words. Someone had been in her room while she slept, close enough to kill her. But they hadn't killed her. They'd warned her, which meant they weren't sure yet. They didn't know how much she knew. They were testing her, waiting to see what she would do. Grace made a choice. She went to the East Wing. She sat beside Marcus, and she told him everything. I know you're in there, she said, holding his hand. I know you're listening, and I know what happened to you. Your father tried to have you killed because you were going to change things, because you were going to be better than him. Marcus's hand twitched in hers. I'm not going to let them win. I'm not going to let them silence you. But I need your help. I need you to fight. I need you to come back. Can you do that for me? Can you fight? The monitors beeped. The machines hummed, and Marcus's eyes moved beneath his closed lids. He was dreaming. He was fighting. He was coming back. 3 days later, someone tried to kill Marcus again. Grace was in the kitchen getting tea when the alarms went off. She ran to the East Wing, her heart pounding, and found chaos. Marcus was seizing, his whole body convulsing, monitors screaming. What happened? She shouted. Rebecca, the nurse, looked terrified. I don't know. His IV bag, something was wrong with it. Grace looked at the IV, at the label, at the contents. Potassium chloride, a lethal dose, the same drug used in executions. Get it out of him, she screamed. Get it out now. What followed was the longest 10 minutes of Grace's life. As the medical team worked frantically to save Marcus, she stood in the corner, her fists clenched, her mind racing. This wasn't a warning. This was an attempt. Someone had switched the IV bags. Someone with access. Someone on the inside. When Marcus finally stabilized, Grace found Victoria Wellington in the hallway. The older woman was pale, shaking genuine fear in her eyes. Your son was just poisoned, Grace said, her voice steady. Someone in this house tried to murder him, and I think I know who. Victoria's eyes widened. What are you talking about? The same person who caused his accident 3 years ago. The same person who's been covering it up ever since. Grace stepped closer. Your husband, Mrs. Wellington. Your husband tried to kill your son, and tonight he tried to finish the job. The color drained from Victoria's face. For a moment, she looked like she might collapse. And then something extraordinary happened. Victoria Wellington, cold, cruel, impossible, Victoria Wellington began to cry. I know, she whispered. I've always known. I just couldn't. I couldn't face it. He's a monster. He's always been a monster. But he's my husband, the father of my child. How do you accept that the man you married wanted to murder your son? Grace felt her heart crack. Just a little. Because even monsters have victims. And sometimes those victims become monsters themselves. What are you going to do about it? Grace asked. Victoria wiped her eyes, straightened her spine. And in that moment, she looked less like a society matriarch and more like a mother bear defending her cub. I'm going to destroy him. Marcus Wellington's eyes opened, not a flutter, not a twitch, not the gradual stirring that doctors had predicted might happen, if it ever happened at all. No. His eyes opened like someone who had been pretending to sleep and had finally decided to stop. Clear, aware, focused. And the first thing he said after 3 years of silence, after multiple attempts on his life, after millions of dollars spent on specialists who said he'd never wake up, the first words out of Marcus Wellington's mouth were, Grace. Where is Grace? The nurse dropped her clipboard. Dr. Morrison dropped his coffee. And across the estate, in the servants' quarters, Grace Okonkwo dropped to her knees and thanked God. Because Marcus Wellington was awake. The war had begun. After Victoria Wellington's tearful confession, her admission that she'd suspected her husband's involvement in Marcus's accident for years, everything changed. The cold, cruel matriarch that Grace had first met was gone. replaced by something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose. "I want you to tell me everything," Victoria said. They were in her private study, doors locked, curtains drawn. "Everything you found, everything you suspect. I need to know it all." Grace had hesitated. Despite Victoria's apparent transformation, trust didn't come easy. This was the same woman who had treated her like furniture for weeks, the same woman who had looked through her rather than at her. "Mrs. Wellington, Victoria, if we're going to do this, we might as well use first names." Grace nodded slowly. "Victoria, why should I trust you? You shouldn't." Victoria's voice was raw. "I've been a terrible person. I've known my husband was cruel, and I looked the other way. I've benefited from wealth built on suffering, and I didn't ask questions. I've treated the people who work in my home as less than human because that's what I was taught to do." She met Grace's eyes. "But Marcus is my son, my only child, and the thought that his father tried to kill him, that while I was attending charity luncheons and board meetings, my boy was lying in that bed because of the man I sleep next to every night." Her voice broke. Grace watched her, saw the genuine anguish, and made a decision. "I have evidence," she said, "a USB drive, documents, financial records showing a payment to the man who crashed into Marcus, a memo discussing how to handle the Marcus problem." Victoria's hand went to her throat. "Dear God, there's more. The attempt on Marcus's life 3 nights ago, the poisoned IV bag. Someone inside this house made that switch. I believe it was coordinated with your husband, though I can't prove it yet. Who did it? Who's helping him?" Grace hesitated. This was the part she'd been dreading. "I'm not certain, but I have suspicions about Margaret Chen." The silence was deafening. "Margaret?" Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. "Margaret has been with us for 15 years. She was there when Marcus was born. She's been covering up information about the accident, destroying files, warning me to stop asking questions." Grace leaned forward. "I don't know if she's a willing participant or if she's being coerced, but she's involved." Victoria stood, walked to the window, looked out at the empire her husband had built, an empire stained with her son's blood. "What do? We gather more evidence, we document everything, and we find out exactly who switched that IV bag." Grace's voice hardened. "And then we take your husband down, legally, publicly, in a way he can't escape." Victoria turned back. In her eyes, Grace saw something new: resolution, purpose, a mother's rage channeled into something cold and purposeful. "Tell me what you need." The next 2 days were a delicate dance of deception. Victoria played her part perfectly. She hosted dinners, attended social functions, and treated her husband with the same distant courtesy she'd always shown. Richard Wellington, for his part, seemed relaxed, confident. The assassination attempt had failed, but he clearly believed he'd gotten away with it again. Meanwhile, Grace worked in the shadows. With Victoria's help, she gained access to the house's security system. The estate had cameras everywhere, something Richard had installed years ago, ostensibly for security. But what Richard didn't know was that Victoria had her own back door into the system. "My husband thought he was the only one with secrets," Victoria had said, her smile cold. He was wrong. Grace reviewed footage from the night of the poisoning, hour after hour of empty hallways and quiet rooms, until she found it. 3017 a.m., the East Wing service corridor. A figure moving quickly, keeping their head down, a bag in their hands. Margaret Chen. Grace zoomed in, watched as Margaret entered the medication storage room, watched as she emerged 3 minutes later, bag empty. She did it, Grace breathed. But there was something else, something that made Grace's blood run cold. After leaving the medication room, Margaret went to the main house, to Richard Wellington's study. She entered, she stayed for exactly 4 minutes, and when she emerged, she was crying. Grace sat back, thought about everything she'd learned, about Margaret's warning, "You don't understand what you're dealing with," about the fear in her eyes, about the tears. What if Margaret wasn't a willing participant? What if she was another victim? Grace found Margaret in the garden the next morning. The house manager was sitting alone on a stone bench, staring at nothing, looking older than she had ever looked before. "May I sit?" Margaret flinched, then nodded. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. The birds sang, the fountain burbled, the world went on, indifferent to the darkness at the heart of this beautiful place. "I know it was you," Grace finally said. "The IV bag. I have footage." Margaret's shoulders slumped. She didn't deny it, didn't argue, didn't threaten. She just started crying. He has my daughter. Grace went still. What? My daughter? Sarah, she lives in California, or she did. She got into trouble a few years ago. Financial trouble. She was going to lose everything. I went to Mr. Wellington for a loan. I'd been loyal to him for so long, I thought. She laughed bitterly. He gave me the money. But there were conditions. Conditions I didn't understand until it was too late. Margaret looked at Grace, her face ravaged with guilt. He owns her now, her debts, her business, her apartment. If I don't do what he says, he destroys her. He's made that very clear. So you've been helping him all this time. I sealed the files about the accident. I warned you to stop asking questions. I did everything he told me to do, hoping he'd eventually let her go. Margaret's voice cracked. But then he ordered me to poison Marcus, his own son. He said if I didn't do it, Sarah would be found dead in her apartment within 24 hours, made to look like a suicide. Grace felt sick. The layers of cruelty, the casual destruction of lives. Why didn't you come forward? There are laws. Laws? Margaret's laugh was hollow. You think laws apply to men like Richard Wellington? He has judges in his pocket, police captains, federal officials. The system is built to protect people like him and crush people like us. Us. The word hung in the air. Two women, one Asian, one black, both rendered invisible by the same forces, both used and discarded by the same powerful men. Grace reached out and took Margaret's hand. What if I told you there was another way? Margaret looked at her. Hope flickered, faint but present. What do you mean? Richard thinks he's untouchable because he controls the system, but there are things even money can't buy. Public opinion, media scrutiny, the court of social justice. Grace squeezed her hand. We have evidence, real evidence, of what he did to Marcus, of the payments, of the attempts on his son's life. If we go public, really public, with everything, he won't be able to suppress it. He'll kill us. He can't kill everyone. And once the story is out there, killing us becomes evidence of guilt. Margaret hesitated. Grace could see the war playing out behind her eyes. Years of fear versus the chance for redemption. The threat to her daughter versus the crime she'd been forced to commit. My daughter, Margaret whispered, will protect her. Victoria has resources too. And I have contacts, journalists, activists, people who can shine a light so bright that Richard won't be able to hide in the shadows anymore. A long moment passed. Then Margaret straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and became, for the first time in years, something more than a servant. Tell me what to do. That night, Grace sat with Marcus as usual, reading, talking, playing music, the routine that had become sacred. But something was different. His vital signs had been changing over the past week. More brain activity, more response to stimuli. The doctors were cautiously optimistic for the first time in 3 years. Grace could feel it too. A presence in the room that hadn't been there before. A sense that someone was listening. Really listening. Marcus, she said softly, setting down the book. I don't know if you can hear me, but I need to tell you something. We found out the truth about the accident, about your father. We have evidence. We're going to expose everything. She took his hand. But I need you to fight. I need you to come back, because when you wake up, you're going to have to be strong. Stronger than you've ever been. Your father is going to try to destroy you, to discredit you, to claim you're mentally incompetent and can't manage your own affairs. She leaned closer. You have to prove him wrong. You have to show the world who you really are. Can you do that? Can you fight for yourself? For everyone who's been hurt by him? The monitors beeped. The machines hummed, and Marcus's eyes fluttered. Grace held her breath. His eyes fluttered again. His hand twitched in hers. And then, impossibly, miraculously, they opened. Clear, aware, focused. Grace, he said. His voice was rough, unused for 3 years. But it was there. He was there. Where is Grace? She was already crying. I'm here. I'm right here. I heard you, he whispered. Every day. I heard everything. The next day was chaos. Word of Marcus's awakening spread through the estate like wildfire. The medical team ran endless tests. Specialists were summoned. The phone rang constantly. And through it all, Marcus refused to see anyone but Grace. I need to talk to her, he told Dr. Morrison, his voice growing stronger by the hour. Alone. The doctor hesitated. Now. When they were finally alone, Marcus reached for her hand. I need to tell you what I remember. About that night. Grace nodded. Take your time. I wasn't supposed to be driving that night. I had my car, but I always used the driver for late trips. But someone called me, said there was an emergency at the office, said I needed to come immediately. Who called? My father's assistant. But when I got to the office, no one was there. The whole thing was a setup. Marcus's jaw tightened. And then, on the way home, I started feeling strange, drowsy, confused, like I'd been drugged. The sedative they found in your blood. Yes. Someone put something in my coffee before I left. I didn't realize until I was already on the road. I was trying to pull over when the other car hit me. Grace processed this. So it wasn't just the crash. They drugged you first to make sure you couldn't react in time. My father wanted me dead. He knew I was going to change everything when I took over. End the overseas operations. Expose the labor violations. Redirect company resources to sustainable ventures. Marcus's eyes hardened. He couldn't allow that. Billions of dollars were at stake. His legacy, his power. We have evidence, Grace said. Documents, financial records, footage. Your mother is on our side now. Margaret, too. Margaret? She was being coerced. Your father was threatening her daughter. Marcus closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet with tears. How many people has he hurt? How many lives has he destroyed to protect his empire? More than we'll ever know. But it ends now. Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, really looked at her. At this woman who had been hired to clean his family's house and had instead chosen to save his life. This woman whose voice had reached him through the darkness. This woman who had refused to give up when everyone else had. Why? He asked. Why did you do all this? You didn't know me. You had nothing to gain. You put yourself in danger for a stranger. Grace smiled. It was the same smile her grandmother used to wear. The one that said she knew something about the universe that others didn't. Because, Marcus, that's what good people do. They help. Even when it's hard, even when it's dangerous, even when the person they're helping is a stranger. She squeezed his hand. My grandmother taught me that every person you meet is fighting a battle you can't see. Every person deserves compassion. Every person deserves someone in their corner. Even the heir to a $600 million empire. Even him. Maybe especially him. Because from what I can see, you're the loneliest person in this house. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something Grace would never forget. When this is over, I want to do something for you. To thank you. You don't owe me anything. Yes, I do. You gave me my life back. But more than that, you reminded me why my life is worth fighting for. He met her eyes. I'm not going to forget that. I'm not going to forget you. Richard Wellington returned to the estate that evening, expecting to find his son still unconscious and his secret still safe. Instead, he found a reckoning. They were all waiting for him in the great room. Victoria, Marcus, in a wheelchair but alert, Grace, Margaret, Dr. Morrison, and, unexpectedly, two men in suits who Richard recognized immediately, FBI agents. Richard. Victoria's voice was ice. We need to talk. For the first time in memory, Richard Wellington looked afraid. What is this? What's going on? His eyes darted to Marcus. Son, you're awake. This is wonderful. Why didn't someone call me? Don't, Marcus said. His voice was quiet but carried the weight of 3 years of silence. Don't pretend you're happy to see me. Don't pretend you didn't try to have me killed. Twice. The color drained from Richard's face. That's absurd. Marcus, you're clearly confused. 3 years in a coma. The trauma, you don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. Marcus wheeled himself forward. I remember everything. The fake emergency call. The drugged coffee. The car that accidentally ran a red light. I remember it all, and we have proof. Grace stepped forward. The USB drive contains financial records showing a $50,000 payment to Thomas Harwell 2 weeks before the accident. There's also a memo discussing how to handle the Marcus problem. And we have security footage of Margaret Chen being coerced into poisoning Marcus's IV 3 nights ago on your orders. Margaret stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But I won't be your puppet anymore. I've given a full statement to the FBI. They know everything. Richard's mask finally cracked. The charming businessman, the philanthropist, the pillar of society, all of it fell away. What remained was something ugly, something desperate. You think this will hold up? You think anyone will believe a maid and a disgruntled employee over me? He turned to Victoria. And you're part of this? After everything I've given you? Given me? Victoria stood, trembling with rage. You tried to murder our son. You tried to take my child from me. There is nothing you have ever given me that compares to what you tried to take. Richard's eyes darted to the FBI agents. I want my lawyer, Mr. Going. Wellington, one of the agents said, stepping forward. You're under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, witness tampering, and fraud. You have the right to remain silent. As the agents handcuffed Richard Wellington, he made one last desperate move. He lunged toward Marcus, hands reaching for his son's throat. This is your fault, he screamed. You ungrateful, idealistic fool. I built everything. I gave you everything, and you were going to destroy it all. The agents restrained him. But before they pulled him away, Marcus spoke. No, Father, I was going to make it better. I was going to make it mean something. That's what scared you. Not that I'd destroy your legacy, but that I'd show the world it was built on sand. Richard Wellington was dragged from the house, screaming threats that no one believed anymore. The great man brought low. The emperor exposed as having no clothes. And standing in the corner, watching it all, was Grace Okonkwo, the maid, the healer, the woman who had done the unthinkable. The headlines were everywhere. Wellington Empire crumbles. Patriarch convicted of attempted murder. Son testifies against father in shocking courtroom drama. The maid who saved a millionaire. Inside the incredible story of Grace Okonkwo. Richard Wellington was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. His assets were frozen. His board members fled like rats from a sinking ship. The factories overseas were shut down. Their workers finally freed from conditions that bordered on slavery. But the bigger story, the one that captured the world's imagination, was Grace. Her photograph was everywhere. Interviews, magazine covers, talk shows. The black maid from Nigeria who had seen what the doctors missed. Who had reached a comatose man when no one else could. Who had uncovered a murder plot and brought a billionaire to justice. She hated the attention, hated the cameras and the questions and the endless retelling of events she'd rather forget. But she understood why it mattered. Because her story wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been overlooked. Everyone who had ever been dismissed because of the color of their skin or the job they worked or the country they came from. It was about the invisible people whose contributions keep the world running but who never get credit. And it was about something else too, something she tried to explain in her one and only televised interview. People ask me why I did what I did, she said, looking into the camera with those steady, knowing eyes. They expect some complicated answer. But the truth is simple. I did it because it was right. I did it because every human being deserves dignity. I did it because my grandmother taught me that we're all connected, that what happens to one of us happens to all of us. She paused, smiled. And I did it because Marcus Wellington, underneath all the wealth and privilege, was just a person. A lonely, broken person who needed someone to see him. That's all any of us really need. To be seen, to be valued, to be treated like we matter. The interview went viral. Millions of views, thousands of comments from people who said Grace's words had changed how they saw the world. But for Grace, the real reward came on a quiet afternoon, 3 months after the trial. Grace was packing her bags. She'd decided it was time to move on. The Wellington estate, despite everything, had never felt like home. There was too much darkness in its walls, too many ghosts, a knock at her door. Marcus stood in the doorway. He was using a cane now, but walking on his own. Physical therapy had done wonders. His color had returned. His eyes had regained their spark. Going somewhere? It's time, Grace said. I've done what I came to do. Now I need to figure out what comes next. Marcus entered the room, sat on the edge of her bed, looked at the small suitcase that contained everything she owned. What if I told you I had an idea about that? I'd say I'm not interested in charity. He laughed. It was the first time she'd ever heard him really laugh, full and warm and genuine. This isn't charity. This is an investment. He pulled an envelope from his pocket. Open it. Grace hesitated, then opened the envelope. Inside was a check for $2 million. And beneath it, a letter. She read the letter, read it again, looked up at Marcus with tears in her eyes. The Grace Okonkwo Foundation for Healthcare Education, Marcus said. Full scholarships for nursing and medical students from disadvantaged backgrounds. State-of-the-art training facilities. Partnerships with hospitals across the country. All funded by a permanent endowment from the Wellington estate. I can't accept this. You can't refuse it. Marcus stood, took her hands in his. Grace, you saved my life. Not just my physical life, my soul. When I was in that darkness, your voice was the only light. You taught me what it means to really care about someone, to see someone, to value someone for who they are, not what they can give you. He smiled. This foundation will let you do that for thousands of people. It will create an army of caregivers who think like you, who see like you, who heal like you. It's not charity, it's legacy. Grace looked at the check, at the letter, at this young man who had been reborn in the fires of tragedy and emerged as something beautiful. There's one condition, she said. Name it. The students we train, the facilities we build, the programs we run, none of it is exclusive. Rich or poor, black or white, immigrant or native born. Everyone gets the same chance. Everyone gets seen. Marcus grinned. I wouldn't have it any other way. The Grace Okonkwo Foundation opened its first training facility in Hartford, Connecticut on a beautiful spring day. Dignitaries attended, cameras flashed, speeches were made. But the moment Grace would remember wasn't the ribbon cutting or the applause. It was after, when the crowds had dispersed and she walked through the empty hallways of the building that bore her name, looking at the state-of-the-art equipment, the classrooms, the simulation labs where future nurses and doctors would learn to save lives. She stopped at a window, looked out at the city below. In her pocket was the little wooden elephant her grandmother had given her all those years ago. She took it out, held it up to the light. Elephants never forget, she whispered, and neither did I. Behind her, footsteps. She turned. Victoria Wellington stood there, the woman who had once looked through Grace like she was invisible, the woman who had dismissed her as the help, the woman who had almost let her son die because facing the truth was too painful. But Victoria was different now. The coldness had melted. The walls had come down. She was, for perhaps the first time in her life, truly human. I wanted to thank you, Victoria said, for everything. You've thanked me enough. The foundation. Not for that, for showing me what I'd become, for helping me find my way back to my son, for proving that, she paused, gathered herself, for proving that I was wrong. About everything, about people like you, about what matters, about how to live. Grace nodded, accepted the apology for what it was, genuine, hard-won, and precious. Mrs. Wellington, Victoria. Grace smiled. Victoria, what are you going to do now? Victoria looked out the window. At the city, at the sky, at the future. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to earn the second chance you gave me. I'm going to take all the wealth and privilege I was born into and use it to lift others up instead of keeping them down. She turned back to Grace. I'm going to try to be more like you. They stood together in silence. Two women from different worlds, united by tragedy and reborn through grace. Finally, Grace spoke. You know what my grandmother used to say? What? She used to say that the universe has a way of putting people exactly where they need to be, that there are no accidents, no coincidences, only opportunities to become who we're meant to be. Grace put the elephant back in her pocket. I spent my whole life wondering why I never got to finish nursing school, why I had to spend 20 years cleaning houses for people who couldn't be bothered to learn my name, why the road was so hard and the destination was so unclear. She turned to Victoria. Her eyes were bright. Her smile was radiant. Now I know. Everything that happened, all the setbacks, all the struggles, all the invisible years, it all led me here, to your house, to your son, to this moment. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. Do you believe that? That it was all meant to be? Grace laughed. It was the laugh of someone who had seen the darkness and found the light. I believe that we have a choice. Every moment, every day, we choose who we're going to be. We choose whether to see other people or look through them. We choose whether to help or to hurt. We choose whether to tear down or build up. She gestured to the building around them. This foundation exists because I made a choice. Marcus is alive because I made a choice. You're standing here, free from the man who is destroying you because I made a choice. She took Victoria's hands. And now it's your turn. Every day for the rest of your life, you'll have the same choice. What kind of person do you want to be? What kind of mark do you want to leave on the world? Victoria squeezed her hands. One that matters. Then go make it happen. That evening, Grace drove to a small cemetery on the outskirts of town. She parked, walked through the quiet rows of headstones until she found the one she was looking for. Mother of Grace, she taught us to see with our hearts. Grace knelt, placed a single flower on the grave, and spoke to the woman who had shaped everything she had become. I did it, Mama. I kept my promise. I never forgot who I was, never forgot where I came from, and I never stopped believing that every person deserves to be seen. The wind rustled through the trees. A bird sang somewhere in the distance. The world tried to make me invisible, tried to tell me I was less than, tried to put me in a box and keep me there forever. But you taught me something they couldn't take away. You taught me that my worth isn't determined by what other people see. It's determined by what I know is true. She stood, wiped the tears from her cheeks, smiled at the headstone. I'm going to help a lot of people, Mama. Young people who remind me of myself. People who have been told they can't, they shouldn't, they aren't enough. I'm going to show them what you showed me, that the only limits that matter are the ones we put on ourselves. She turned to leave, then stopped. Look back one last time. Elephants never forget, she said, and neither will they, I promise. Grace Okonkwo walked back to her car as the sun set behind her. Tomorrow, there would be work to do, students to mentor, lives to change, a legacy to build. But tonight, she was simply grateful for the journey that had brought her here, for the battles that had made her strong, for the love that had never let her go, and for the simple, powerful truth her grandmother had taught her all those years ago: every person matters. Every act of kindness ripples outward, and sometimes the person who changes the world is the one no one expected, the maid, the invisible woman, the one who did the unthinkable. This story is dedicated to everyone who has ever been overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated. Your worth is not determined by how others see you. Your potential is not limited by their expectations. And your impact, the ripples you send out into the world, may be greater than you ever imagine. Never forget who you are. Never forget where you come from. And never stop believing in the power of one person to change everything.